Here.
Chairman Paneleon,
Here.
Alderman Novit,
Here.
Alderman Waldeck,
Here.
Alderman Moore,
Here.
Alderman Reisenberg, Alderman Tack,
Here.
Alderman Palmer,
Here.
Alderman Edelman.
Here.
Mr. Chairman, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Elizabeth. The second item on the agenda is consideration of minutes from the Finance Committee meeting held on September 30th, 2013. Are there any comments or corrections? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to approve.
So moved. Second.
Seconded by Alderman Palmer. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously. The third item on our agenda is consideration of the fiscal year 2013 Treasurer's Report, which will be presented by Elizabeth Holub, the Finance Director for the City of Lake Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In accordance with state statute, an annual treasurer's report is filed with the city clerk, the county clerk, and published in the Lake Forester within 6 months of the end of the fiscal year. The report is included in your packet for your review and any questions. It is also on the city council agenda this evening for the city council to acknowledge receipt. And upon acknowledgement this evening, it would be published in the Lake Forester on Thursday. Happy to entertain any questions.
Questions on the Treasurer's Report? I would entertain a motion that we accept the Treasurer's Report.
So moved.
Second?
Seconded by Alderman Novit. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes unanimously, and the Treasurer's Report is accepted. Fourth item on our agenda is the fiscal year 2015 mission statement. At a prior meeting, there were some editorial comments about the mission statement, and I believe it's been modified somewhat. And if there are any further comments, I would appreciate hearing them.
Would it make more sense, I know we've been through this and through this, but if you eliminated the "to" before "promote"? So
Alderman Waldeck is suggesting that we eliminate the word "to" before "promote."
Well, unless you're going to put another two in front of B, as in to be. Right. Or not to be. It's up to you.
And that way it would read, "be the best managed, fiscally responsible and appealing community, and promote a community spirit of trust, respect, and citizen involvement."
Yeah, so
I think it sounds a little bit better, but
For my part, I made the exact same editorial note on my list. So anybody else feel that we should delete the word "to" in the third line?
No, I'd like to add a two at the beginning.
Yeah, why don't we just move it to the beginning?
No, add a one. Add one.
Can we
We're gonna
insert
move-
the word darn after the? Just a thought.
Okay. There's a motion on the floor. Maybe Alderman Waldeck would like to move that we strike the word "to" from the third line?
or add the word "to" before
Why don't we
"be."
just
We'll pick
move the
one.
word to,
That's a third?
move it to the beginning? How's that?
That would be fine as well.
What's the motion and what's the vote?
It's your motion.
I move to strike the "to," or in the alternative, to add "to" before "be."
Okay. I'll second it if the motion is, in essence, to move the to from where it is to the beginning of the sentence.
That's exactly what it is.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? There will be no further editorial adjustments to the mission statement until next year. The next item is the 2013 property tax levy estimate presented by Elizabeth Holub, Finance Director.
It's going to be a little bit easier for me to do that from over here. This evening, we would officially begin discussion of the 2013 property tax levy. It is proposed that the city follow this timeline on November 4th. Approve a tax levy estimate. This would be a non-binding estimate, and it would meet a state statute requirement that the city council approve an estimated tax levy 20 days in advance of adopting the tax levy ordinance. And if deemed necessary, establish a public hearing date. On November 18th, we would schedule the first reading of the 2013 tax levy ordinance. If a public hearing is required, November 21st, publish notice of that public hearing, and on December 2nd at the city council meeting, conduct the public hearing if required, and schedule the second reading and final approval of the tax levy ordinance. That would allow us to have the tax levy adopted in time to file that with the Lake County clerk prior to the deadline required, which is the final Tuesday of December. Included in the packet for policy discussion this evening was an attachment 5 in order to not inundate you with a lot of schedules of detailed information. We left out 1 through 4, but to quickly get you to the policy question in attachment 5, I'm going to quickly run through attachment 1 through 4. Attachment 1 is a schedule that we use each year to use the tax levy cap applicable to non-home rule communities that come under the property tax extension limitation law, and the assessed valuation estimates provided by Lake County in September to establish the allowable tax levy based on the extended tax levy for the prior year applicable to the city's tax levy. So it is currently estimated that the city will have a 4.6% reduction in its assessed valuation from the prior year based on the estimates provided by Lake County, and $6.2 million in new construction growth that is eligible for additional property taxes outside the tax cap limitation. So based on that, we calculate a maximum allowable tax extension with the 1.7% tax cap applicable to the 2013 levies, and also determine that there's $70,618 in taxes eligible for the new construction EAV. We then take the 2012 extended levy. So these are the extended taxes related to the 2012 levy in the various components, and we apply the increases in the for the 2013 levy by component. And what we do is we first look at police and fire pension, and we take the actuarial requirement determined by the independent actuary for the current year, and you can see what their actuarial determined tax levy requirement is for police and fire, with the small component for fire pension that is outside the tax cap included down here. But you can see that those have fairly significant increases over the prior year. We put those amounts in first. Most of the line items just have the 1.7% applied to it, which is the tax cap amount applicable to the current year's levy. And then we use just we take the baseline amount here for the total levy under tax cap, and the amount that's left is applied to the general corporate levy. So that funds the general operating amount. So you can see that because of the amount taken by police and fire pension, that addition is just 0.49% because the police and fire pension consumes such a large portion of the change between 12 and 13. Then we have the bond fund amounts, which are just based on the actual issues that are funded from the debt service levy. You can see the cap that's applicable, and then the amount that's scheduled for the 2013 levy. And the total levy before new growth and allowances. We've got a small increment of the fire pension that is by state statute outside the cap. We have the special recreation levy, which is just estimated to be increased by 1.7%, same as the cap. And then the flat amount that is due to new construction. That is distributed between the general fund levy and the library levy on a prorated basis based on the prior year's extended levy. Attachment 3 just begins to fold those in to the basic line items for the tax levy ordinance. And then attachment 4 uses the totals and begins to calculate the estimated impact on an average homeowner. We use a home with 800,000 market value. And so we take the 2012 extended levy from the prior year, the projected 2013 levy for the current year. We take the levy before growth and extensions, which is the 1.7, the growth and exclusions, the bond funds, and we look at the total amount. You can see when all of those are aggregated together, it's a 2.82% increase over the prior year's extended levy. Then we take the projected equalized assessed valuation for the city as a whole from attachment 1. We take the total city levy and calculate a projected tax rate. We take the average home market value last year of 800,000. We take the estimated decrease for the city as a whole of 4.6. That average home would have a market value this year of 763,000. From home to home, this is going to vary, but we just take it as an average based on the total EAV projected for Lake Forest. And then the equalized assessed valuation is 1/3. This calculates based on the projected rate and the EAV, the estimated tax bill for that home, prior year extended, current year estimated, and the dollar impact and percentage increase for that average home. And that would represent both the city and library portion of the tax bill, which combine for about 22 to 23% of the tax bill. So those are attachments 1 through 4. The policy question for the committee to discuss this evening is that at the Finance Committee meeting on September 30th, we talked a lot about alternative revenues and options for the city to meet challenges on the horizon in the 5-year general fund financial forecast, with expenditures growing at a faster rate than revenues, and with the challenges faced by the city in that the city has achieved great efficiencies and reduced personnel, but has pretty much maxed that out. We are seeing fewer and fewer opportunities for those efficiencies without impacting the level of services to residents. And so,
Just a quick one before you get too far away from it. I guess it's a bit of a curiosity. How is the 4.6% decrease in EAV determined?
that is,
Average, but who decided it wasn't a 2% gain?
that is based solely on the fact that Lake County in September provides us an estimated total EAV for Lake Forest. So they've told us that their current estimate for all properties in Lake Forest is this amount, and compared to the certified assessed valuation of last year, it's a 4.6% decrease.
Okay, and the other question I had was, when the tax rate changes, if it does, how does that line up with our fiscal year? Is it a calendar tax year and a fiscal Lake Forest year, and then you take part and part, and or does it line up with our fiscal year?
The tax levy that is approved by the City Council in December is based on valuations as of January 1st, 13, and they are applied to tax bills that are sent out in calendar 14.
I
Okay.
understand the tax bill part. I'm just wondering how our budget relates when we calculate our revenue.
Okay.
Do you take the blend, or is it a,
The December 13 levy will be
LIFO kind of
collected in
question?
calendar 14, but it's fiscal 15 budget revenue.
so the whole year will be based on the new number?
Right,
Okay, thank you.
right. Sorry, I misunderstood your
That's
question.
okay.
One of the significant challenges that we see going forward is the state's fiscal crisis, and the fact that the city receives $2.3 million this year in revenue from the state. And 1.7 million of that comes from income tax revenue, and that goes directly into the general fund and funds the operating budget. Just under .1 is replacement tax revenue, also goes into the general fund operating budget, so a total of 1.8 million funds general fund operating services. And about $500,000 is motor fuel tax revenue that goes into the motor fuel tax fund, and every third year funds the street improvement program, so that's funds capital improvements. So the concern is that as the state begins to grapple with its own fiscal crisis, will they reduce or eliminate revenues to municipalities in the same manner as they've already reduced replacement tax revenues? And they have in the past had bills considered reducing income tax revenues and distributions to local municipalities. So one question that was raised on September 30th and discussed was the potential for increasing property taxes beyond the tax cap for a specific purpose. And would removing the city's reliance on the state for revenues in the general fund operating budget be a purpose that the city council would be interested in pursuing as a means to prevent general fund budget shortfalls in the future imposed by the state's decisions to reduce revenues to the city and other local governments in the state. So attachment 5 here is similar to attachment 4, and what it does is it creates a scenario where the city could apply an additional amount to the property tax levy, and in this case it's called state income tax replacement. That could be any amount, but that amount would go into the general fund budget, and a same amount would be taken out of the general fund budget and put in the capital fund budget instead. So you would be replacing income tax revenue in the general fund budget with property taxes and moving that income tax revenue to a capital fund budget instead. The theory being that a capital fund budget is better able to sustain that loss of revenue because you can either defer those capital expenditures or bond for them. But in the meantime, you can defer bond financing because you've got these revenues until the state imposes some restrictions or elimination of that revenue source. And you could phase this in over time until you had completely replaced that revenue source in the general fund with property taxes and eliminated that state revenue source in a general fund operating budget.
My recollection is we were talking about getting in a position to be free of the state taxes, like a rainy day fund if they cut us off. Right. But the other side of that is, unless we put it in a rainy day fund that we can't use for something else, we're increasing taxes because we're still getting the state. And unless there are some controls on this, like we won't touch this fund unless and until the state cuts us off, and only to that amount.
Like Social Security.
It's just going to be sitting there. We can put it in T-bills, I suppose, or something really secure, even though our own bonds are rated higher, I believe.
Yes.
Further, don't you see this as a potential self-fulfilling prophecy? So we do this, it's noticed, and the end result is exactly, what we're preparing for. Because they say, look at what these home rule communities are doing. Therefore, they don't need the money anymore. Therefore, let's cut them off.
Although, Randy, I don't think anybody in Springfield is looking to see what Lake Forest is doing and make a decision based upon that. And Bob, I'd be interested in having your comments as well. But I mean, we've had some fairly lengthy discussions about it with George and Elizabeth and Bob. And Bob, I think your comment's a good one. But I think there is real deep concern that the revenues coming from Springfield will begin to be reduced or eliminated. And whether we do it or don't do it, I don't think is going to have an impact on what they choose to do with what has been our money. Bob, did you want to?
Well, and I think all of you have a copy of the article that was just in today's Tribune, and I think that's a strong signal that the income tax increase that we saw a couple of years ago is not going away, and even despite that fact, they still fall further and further behind, which, at least in municipal circles, we fight every year to not lose any more money, although we keep getting money chipped away. We were just talking about how much we lost in the personal property tax replacement when they decided that they needed to take some of that to help fund the regional school superintendents. So I think it's a real question of pay me now or pay me later. And are we going to position ourselves today to start looking at this, and whether we put it in a rainy day fund or somewhere, so it's out there and only the city council can make a determination if they want to use it and for what purposes. But I think, you know, one of the thoughts that the staff had, we want to avoid not doing the necessary legwork and preparation, and then they cut us off, and now we're talking about a double-digit increase in property taxes, and I don't think anybody wants that. So it was really a question of how can we take this opportunity to be forward-thinking, to begin planning for what I personally believe is inevitable. I think it's just a matter of when they're going to cut us off, not a matter of if. And I think to Alderman Tack's point is that what Lake Forest does in and of itself is probably not going to influence the state legislature, and I don't know if some communities will follow the lead of Lake Forest or not. There are other communities that are very dependent on sales tax revenue or looking for ways to replace property taxes or lost income taxes with sales tax. So I think every community is going to be different in how they respond to this, but in Lake Forest's case, we are primarily a residential community, and we are, whether we like it or not, fairly dependent upon property taxes as a major source of revenue for our operations.
I mean, there was already a move last year or the year before in the state legislature to essentially confiscate this income tax reimbursement. I mean, this was the history of the income tax, and Bob, correct me if, or Elizabeth, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is that the history of this income tax is that cities around the state, particularly Chicago, were talking about imposing a state or a city income tax.
Right.
And the notion that however many hundreds or thousands of cities and towns in Illinois were going to start to impose their own city or town income tax was an administrative nightmare, lots of duplication of effort, lots of inefficiencies. So what happened was the state said, hey, you know what, wouldn't it be a lot better if we just collected it for you? And then we'll send it back to you. You know, we'll just collect it and we'll send it to you. And that seemed like a really efficient thing to do, and so everybody agreed. But here we are now. It's almost like a loan where your rents go to the bank before you get them on a property. You know, they have that money, and they have talked about simply not sending it to us, even though it was originally intended to be passed back. And it was introduced at least 2 years ago. I don't think it went anywhere at that point, but I think I tend to agree with Bob. It's just going to be another step that they take before they have to finally confront the reality that they've got the whole system out of balance. But municipalities per se don't vote. So when they do this, we really won't be able to do much about it. And it's derivative. It's kind of, you'd have to educate the citizens to get them to rally around it. And it's a theoretical thing to the citizens. They don't really see this. But right now, $1.7 million, $1.9 million of our annual operating budget, I mean, that we use to pay the salaries of the city employees. And what's the total budget amount?
2.3 total comes from the state.
But I mean, what's our total operating budget?
Total operating budget is about 30 million,
30 million. So this is roughly
about 5%.
5% of our city budget that we're using to pay salaries with, that all of a sudden, if we leave it where it is, just could disappear in the next year or two. When is the income taxes are supposed to go back up again or back down again?
Down.
Next year or the year after? 2014? I think?
2015.
2015. So that would be the time probably of greatest risk when they're negotiating some sort of a compromise to keep the income taxes from going down. So this is next fiscal year. And I just think it's prudent to, we clearly, there seemed to be a consensus that it would be viable and attractive if we could somehow wean ourselves of dependency from the state sources of revenue. Here, the idea is to build that up over time, and as long as we're still getting it, we'll use it for capital, but that could very well only be for maybe 1 or 2 years. Putting it in T-bills rather than actually using it, who knows? Maybe they come back and try and confiscate it again.
I have a couple of questions. To Alderman Tack's point, can the state select to treat Lake Forest different than Highland Park, or do they treat municipalities all the same?
All municipalities would be treated the same.
Okay, so we couldn't get picked on, so to speak.
Correct.
Well, home rule and non-home rule are treated somewhat differently, right?
So they could pick the home rule as a group and treat them differently, and
They could, but at least right now, the way the income tax and the motor fuel tax, it doesn't matter whether you're home rule or non-home rule. They're all treated, all municipalities are treated the same way in terms of the percentage of the income tax that they receive.
because I was concerned also when I heard it before the discussion that this might be enabling, but it sounds like they'd have to make a big move to. And the other question is, so if we do this additional tax to cover this, is this the $65 difference?
Right, the $65 difference is the
Times how many
incremental
what?
impact of that 580,000.
Is it, okay, so 65,000 per household, or,
$65
I mean, per person?
to the average $800,000 home. It would,
But there's 7,000 homes, which is about less than $500,000, not 2.3 million, and I'm not understanding the math.
it would depend on the assessed valuation. So
But-
the impact would vary,
Absolutely,
right?
but if the average is 7,000, or 800,000, or 763, and there's 7,000 homes about,
Commercial properties are going to pay a large amount.
they would make up the other 1.9 million?
No, I think, Elizabeth, you need to clarify that this isn't going to generate 2.3 million in the first year.
No, this is going to generate $580,000 in the
Oh,
first year.
It's a period of time.
Okay.
Sorry, thank you.
Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I'm just
that's
trying
all
to
right,
make
because that
2.3 out of
orange
that.
line at the top, so what I did was I added 580.
got
That
it now. Sorry
number
about
could
that.
be any number. So just for discussion purposes, I added 580. And then, so that would begin to phase in that replacement of that revenue.
Got it. I
And
just
then
didn't,
each
I just
year
looked
you
at the
could
bottom too
reassess.
quickly there. I
Yeah,
apologize.
I'm sorry.
The idea, David, would be, if we're going to try to replace that revenue, as George said, we could see that change coming over the next year or two. So we looked at the idea of maybe we replace that revenue over a 5-year period. It starts feeling like this may become more real more quickly. So maybe we shrink that down, increase it a little bit more, and replace that revenue over a 3-year period.
So it'd be 580 this year, and then more the next, and then, and so we'd be at 2.3 by the third year.
Yeah.
So what's that, if about 450,000 is residential out of the 588, that's my math, you can't see them.
We're we're about 91% residential, 9% commercial is the
91, 9, okay,
breakdown
so,
for commercial residential.
so in year 3, if we're caught up replacing the $2.3 million, how much more per household would we be charging the residents?
You could just stay at that same amount. So you could,
But the current amount is only generating 588,000. I'm missing something again. I know it's me, but
It adds up over time, but I think we need to explain
okay, so if you have 580,000 the first year, and then the next year, the 580 moves to the right, to the column to the right, and then maybe it's 1.3.
Yep,
And
got
so you're
that.
phasing it in, and then once you get to 2.3.
Yep.
It can just stay there. It can increase by the cap each year. It can,
So if the normal increase would be $86 per household per year without this concept, and to start the concept is $65 more in the first year, blank in the second, blank in the third. By the end of the third year, if we had a 3-year projection of what this would cost the residents per household each year in year 4, 5, and 6, that would reflect, that difference would tell us how much this concept cost us when it's complete. Is that-
right. So
Do you
if you,
have an idea what that is? Is it
580 is roughly 6, we're trying to get to about 2.3. You're going to be.
4 times that?
Almost 3.5 to 4 times that,
I'm
so
sorry.
about 230,
4 times 6 is
220,
24.
230 in total,
Okay.
Total.
in today's dollars.
But in increments over a 3-year period.
But then if we chose to just cover the state, that would be a permanent tax at that point.
We could, well, one of the things
Because
we
we'd need
talked
that
about was
2.3
doing it all
Every
at
year.
once.
And then it would increase at the normal amount.
We could set the number so that it happened in the first year or over 5 years. We looked at both of those and thought 3 was kind of a good
I think it's a
midpoint.
great idea, I just wanted to air it out, because
Right.
if we approve $65 increase, we're really approving a permanent, if the state does what we think they're gonna do, a permanent $240 increase.
Right,
And I just wanted to,
Once it's fully
Once it's done.
stabilized, if you will.
right,
right.
Well, the alternative is to wait for the state to do something and then adjust our tax rates then. So it's no longer, you know, a question or a hypothetical. They've done it. Here's what we're passing on. Otherwise, what we're doing is we're saying, well, we're going to raise your taxes in case the state does this, but meanwhile, we're going to have it in our capital fund and we're going to use it. You know, if you tax it, they will use it. Again, I think if we want more money in our capital fund, we should be forthright and say we want more money in our capital fund. And if anything happens from the state, well, we'll invade other funds if we need to on a short term, but at the end of the day, we'll pass it through to our residents. I see a certain amount of sophistry in this, that, well, we're going to do this in case the state raises or deprives us of our taxes. Why don't we wait, and if the state does, it does, and we will pass it on. Otherwise, if we need more taxes for our capital, we will be forthright with our residents and say, we want to raise your taxes for our own use, period. And because we will at the end of the day, even if we have this, if the state pulls the rug out from under us, we will pass on that on an annual basis. So this idea about softening the shock, we won't. Maybe we'll buy 1 year where we can soften the shock, but after that, we will pass on exactly what the state has taken away from us.
Well,
It's just a year that we're losing, right? If we don't
Year
do
or
it
two, we
now,
don't know
it's
exactly.
next year.
I'd say 2 things to that, Bob. First of all, what we're doing, what is like, what in my, I guess I'm speaking for myself here, but what seems likely is that in conjunction with not reducing income taxes or even increasing income taxes again, we will then be put in a position where we have to double down on that and increase local property taxes all of a sudden. And we'll also be doing it, and I don't know exactly how the timing works here, but one of our concerns is we'll be doing that in an environment where all of a sudden we don't have enough money to pay our salaries. We'll have to cut it from somewhere. It's going to be it won't be, it won't be something we can do with intent and with thought. It'll have to be taken from someplace we really didn't want to. So the idea here is just get that line item out of our operating budget. And as long as we keep getting it, fine, but when we stop getting it, it doesn't affect our ability to pay salaries, which are, remember, 70% of our total expenditures.
We will be able to pay salaries, and I think we have a contingency fund short-term, but if the state does this to us, and I'm not sure it would be that reckless, who knows, we have the ability to raise our taxes to cover our expenses.
but we could
And-
have to wait a year for that too, if we do it if it
Well,
happens in
you're
January.
assuming the state leaves us high and dry.
In January, I'm assuming.
Well,
yeah.
they're also.
I think it will be phased if it happens. We'll have time, and again, at the end of the day, we're gonna pass this on an annual basis. You know, you say it's a shock, that's the shock every year from then on.
Aren't there limitations on what we're allowed to do as an administrative function versus under the home rule? Isn't there a referendum requirement at some point?
No, that's actually just self-imposed by an ordinance, which, depending on what direction you want to go, you would probably want to come back and modify anyways. But I think that as a home rule community, you are significantly below what any state limitation might be, and you can do that. Again, the question is, do you try and ease this in over a period of time, or do you hit them all at once when that time occurs? The only other thing I would add, Alderman Palmer's comments are right on point. I'd just remind the council that the other side of the equation we talked about was the capital side. And we have a shortfall in the capital. You will be issuing debt at some point in the next couple of years. The only question is how much. And so really what you're also doing under this scenario is reducing the amount of debt that you would have to issue by using what revenues you are shifting over there to reduce the amount of debt that would have to be incurred.
I mean, historically, we've tried to run the city over a long period of time on a proactive basis, not on a reactive, oh my God, just look what just happened. And, you know, I think that's, in my way of thinking, that's kind of what the people in Lake Forest expect of us. It might be easier to just simply blame the state when it happens and do something sudden, but it doesn't really have to be that way. And this is, just to my way of thinking, I don't want, nothing's ever painless, but this clearly reduces the amount of potential pain associated with getting control of this issue. And it moves the risk from a place where we really have very limited ability to influence, you know, short of layoffs and things, to a place where we do have a significant amount of managerial control over what year and what budget we have for capital. And to Bob's point, we are short on capital funds as it is.
I would support imposing a tax to put some money in the capital fund, saying that we're doing it because we need to do it. And in the back of our mind, saying, and by the way, if the state does something rash, we can always tap that in other places to make up the shortfall. I just have a problem with presenting this as, oh, we're protecting you against the state doing something bad. I think intellectually that's not forthright. I would rather say, we need money in capital, we're going to raise the taxes to build up our capital fund, and should the state do something, it will be great because we can use that as a buffer. But if the state does something, believe me, the shock is going to get passed through to you, and it's going to be year after year after year. There isn't some shock absorber that we can give you, except we'll be ready for it because we'll have built up the capital fund. But we'll use the capital fund meanwhile. I mean, it's not going to be a rainy day fund. It's a capital fund. We'll use it for whatever we need. But I think we should be forthright with the citizens and say, that's what we're doing.
I think that's what's happening right now. We're saying we're going to use it for capital, and we'll keep it if the state changes their mind, and I think we're talking about it on TV. I mean, I think I think your point is, you're absolutely right. And if this were a closed meeting, I'd be agreeing 100% with you. It sounds divisive, but I think we're making it perfectly clear. We need capital. We have to raise it somehow. If we ramp this up, then we keep it if the state reacts differently. And I agree with you, but I disagree with your conclusion, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Well, I don't know what you think my conclusion is, because I'm in favor of, if we need it for capital, I'm in favor of raising the tax to do that. I just think that the rationale that we put forward shouldn't be, we're doing this to protect you against the state. It may have that effect. We may be able to use it for that. But the real reason is we need more money in the capital fund. It's to our advantage. I just don't buy this argument of, oh, the state's going to do something and we're going to prepare ourselves to be ready for it. I don't think if you really work it through, that's the case.
Well, where you start and where you end up, it's all fungible dollars, right? So we started maybe in a different place, and maybe we end up where you are, and we say this is for the purpose of shoring up our capital fund. But it also has the advantage in going through this process of reducing the risks to our operating circumstances. You know, it's sort of it's, you know, killing two birds with one stone to an extent. And where you start, you know, is okay with, you know, if we start with capital, ultimately, that's another issue, and it is an issue that's important, and we do need to shore up our capital fund. So, as Bob said, we're going to be issuing debt for capital no matter what. It's a question of how much, and the less the better if we're concerned about keeping our AAA credit rating and the low borrowing costs that we enjoy. So I'm completely happy starting from the point of view that we need to shore up our capital fund, but I still like the technique here because it's helping reduce our operating risk as well at the same time.
No, it makes entire sense. And I appreciate what Bob's saying, let's wait until it happens, but it's kind of the storm coming in, and you can see it's getting pretty dark. I think it's inevitable that the state is going to be cutting back on their funding. I don't think we could ignore that. And at this point in time, the shock that would be felt when the state does pull back is gonna, in the short term, affect the operating ability of the city. Cutting back on services, maybe we're gonna have to draw on higher fees on just services provided. We're gonna be, unfortunately, moving fast to look for money. And if we could avoid that, that'd be great. I think we should prepare for it. I hope this is all just an error, but I think it would be foolish to think it's going to be. We can't ignore it. I think this is reasonable. And no one likes to increase taxes. I don't want to be in that position. I'd rather wait forever not to do it, but it's coming, and I hope I'm wrong.
If I can just interject, what we're looking here in annual taxes on an average $800,000 home, this is just the city's portion of it, because the taxes on an $800,000 home are a lot more than $3,000 or $3,100. So the increase that we're looking at here, the dollar change in column 3 as a percentage of the total tax bill, isn't like gonna bang somebody in the head with sticker shock. It's really a de minimis amount in relationship to their total tax bill. It's more significant as a percentage of the city's share of taxes. So I tend to agree with Alderman Palmer in that we're never going to be more than a year behind the 8 ball. And I wouldn't do anything in anticipation of the state cutting us short until they actually do. I mean, you can see the storm out there, and it could blow south of Chicago, it could blow north of Chicago. It may never hit us. I just, in this instance, instead of being proactive, I'm content to be reactive. And like Bob says, if we need to raise capital funds, then let's call it a raise of capital funds and not call it anticipatory of a state breach.
Yeah,
Is there an overlay? Do you have anything that would reflect these potential changes, Elizabeth, that on our 15, or when do our shortfalls show up in the budget overall, 16?
17.
17. If this were implemented and the state did not take their money away, because if they did, obviously, all the numbers would be pretty similar. Is there any way to project? Because, I mean, we're going to have to raise taxes for that as well, or come up with some answer for it.
Well, I think that's an interesting point.
And I
because
don't mean
what
to
it does
complicate
is
it with that, but
it doesn't actually add any dollars to the general fund budget, because all it's doing is replacing one revenue source with another. But it's replacing it with a more reliable revenue source.
but
And
if
so
the
what
state
this
continues
is,
to give us money, does that extend our
it extends,
black
it
income
extends
years?
our ability in the capital fund to finance our capital improvement program without debt. So that's a positive on the capital side. But from the operating budget 5-year financial forecast, the revenue total stays the same. It's just the makeup of it. And it becomes a more reliable, more stable revenue source, and reduces the potential for deteriorating that financial forecast by having a revenue loss that's not
based on the
projected.
assumption the state is less reliable,
Right,
which I would.
right.
But at the end of the day, if we need the funds for capital, and the state does cut us off, what we are going to go back to our residents and say is, here's your income tax increase to pay for what the state has now taken away. I mean, because we need the capital stuff for capital. I mean, I think the problem is expectations, and we should be forthright and say, yeah, we need money in capital, and we'll structure this so it can act as a cushion if the state does something. But at the end of the day, if the state does something, we will pass that through to you. And we need these funds for capital. So, again, it's a matter, I think, of how it's presented. I think we end up kind of in the same place.
Bob, I think that's the whole idea is, you're right, we kind of end up in the same place, but we're trying to figure out how to do both, right? We're trying to make sure that we fund our capital needs without significantly deteriorating the service that we're providing from a capital side, without increasing the amount of debt that we'd like to or be required to do, and also giving us some protection that should those dollars stop coming, that we do have kind of a cushion.
Yeah, it's temporary. I mean, because
Right.
we will have to do something at
Right.
that point. Yeah.
Other comments? I mean, this is for information and input, so if there are not other comments, I would suggest that we move on. We have one more item, one more related item, which is the water rate structure.
Right. This was a topic we were not able to get to on September 30th, but we have been talking for a while about the water rate structure and potential changes that we may want to make for the fiscal year 15 budget year. So we wanted to introduce the topic and have a brief policy discussion to get some direction from the City Council on really what key considerations the City Council feel are the most important in structuring the city's water rates going forward. In developing a water rate structure, there is a fixed rate where a customer pays a flat amount regardless of the usage, or a variable or volume rate where the consumer pays based on the amount of water consumed. The city currently has a blended water rate with both a fixed and variable component, but as you can see from the chart, the yellow represents the fixed rate component and the blue is variable. So the city's current rate structure is predominantly variable rate based currently. And that shows you actual revenues for fiscal year 11 through 13 and budgeted revenue for the current budget year. We looked at data from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, which conducted a survey of 290 Northeast Illinois water utilities that had a service population over 1,000 customers, and found that 88% of them utilize a predominantly variable rate structure similar to the cities, and 11% in total use a block rate. And a block rate is also something that's commonly referred to as a tiered rate, where there is a rate structure that shifts at different consumption levels. And 6% of the systems use an increasing block rate that says that when you hit certain thresholds of consumption, you pay a higher rate. And 5% of them use a decreasing block rate, where when you reach higher consumption levels, you actually pay a lower rate. And then 1% utilize a predominantly flat rate. So that's very, very rare in this area. The key considerations in developing the type of water rate structure you have are the following. First, if you are primarily interested in increasing your revenue stability and minimizing weather fluctuations, you want to have a predominantly fixed rate structure, where you don't want weather fluctuations from year to year to have as significant an impact on your revenues for your budget purposes. However, if you have a significant consideration in your community to promote water conservation, you want to have a predominantly variable rate, because a variable rate structure will promote and incentivize water conservation. Equity. It is very well proven in numerous analyses that consumers equate a variable rate structure with equity. They see a variable rate structure more equitable than a fixed rate, that you pay for what you use. And for cost recovery, given the right structure and set at the right thresholds, a water system can easily recover costs, both variable and fixed costs, with either. So it's really just a matter of setting those at the right levels. But you can accomplish your cost recovery considerations with either a variable or fixed rate. So we identified just 3 policy questions that we would ask the committee to just kind of talk about a little bit and give staff some direction. And then Public Works and Finance will work together to bring back more detailed information for you to consider. But those 3 policy questions are really what the primary objectives here should be for the city's water rate structure, what really are the key considerations and drivers that we should be focused on in developing our rate structure, and should the city increase the proportion of fixed rate revenue generated to enhance revenue stability, and so we are currently 13%. Would you like to see that fixed rate component be higher than that? It certainly helps the capital program, but it does impact both conservation and equity issues associated with the rate structure. And would you be interested in seeing the city implement a seasonal rate, tiered rate, block rate, whatever you want to call that, in order to promote water conservation or to accomplish any other, other features that you would like to see? That aspect is something that we have started to pursue in our current billing system, but is going to take considerable lead time. So that is something that that we would internally need some lead time on implementing, just getting all that set up in the system to get that structured and implemented if we do go that route. But the system is capable of accommodating that type of billing system, so.
Elizabeth? 13% is the fixed rate. What's that in absolute dollars? What's each household paying for the privilege of being connected?
It depends on the size of their meter.
Okay.
So they are paying different rates based on their meter size, as far as what their fixed rates are.
Can you give me an idea?
Let me grab my sheet and I'll.
So I need to get a smaller meter then.
That's right.
So if you have a standard 1.5-inch meter, you're paying $20 a quarter as a fix, so $80 a year is your fixed charge. $80 a year.
That's pretty affordable.
And how is the size of the meter determined?
That's a public works question. Sorry, Michael.
How many bathrooms you have? You have a sprinkling system?
Not the size of the meter, it's the skill of the magician.
No, the size of the water service dictates the size of the meter. So I believe the city building code now requires all new construction to have an 1.5 water service, which would have an 1.5 water meter.
And so what percentages of the houses, residences only, have the 1.5 service today versus an inch service or 3/4 or whatever it might be?
Going back to when we replaced the meters back in 2004, best guess is about 2/3 to 3/4 of this town has 5/8 and 3/4 inch water meters. But they are slowly being replaced by 1.5. One of the issues we talked about too is with sprinkler systems, more sprinkler systems coming in. It's more difficult on those smaller size meters. There's a huge amount of volume going through those meters, and we're having burnouts on the smaller size meters. So we're talking about the topic of potentially requiring increase in their water service line to be able to handle that volume. But a majority of the homes in town have 3/4 and 5/8 inch meters.
And what do they pay, Elizabeth?
Same. So 5/8 to 1.5 are all
20?
the same.
Do we have data as to the basic cost of maintaining the water system, whatever's required with that, even if no one is using any water, how much it would require us to pay to keep that system? And shouldn't that be what we prorate as the fixed cost?
Absolutely.
And then as a variable cost, the cost of us running higher amounts of volume through our filters and that, and then work that into a variable structure? Do we have that kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain components of the budget that vary more with water production than, I mean, certainly our personnel costs aren't going to vary to a great extent with the water production levels due to staffing requirements but then electricity, chemicals, those are certainly going to vary, so yes.
I have a question on water conservation. From what I've picked up so far from the water plant discussions, the increase in sprinkler systems are as much as algae causing us to come up to that point where we have to have problems. It's not that we're necessarily water conservationists, that we built a plant that's this big and so many sprinkler systems, lawn sprinkler systems came in. And isn't this the kind of opportunity where public policy, should the kind of policy we're talking about today steer what we want to have happen with financial consequence, like so many ordinances and building do? If we're worried about big houses, we put a bulk ordinance in. Wouldn't that lead to where I think this leads to, where if you're using a lot of water, you're paying more per gallon? So maybe you'll turn your sprinkler system off or only sprinkle your flower beds. Not necessarily because we have a moral or a value of using less water, but we have a physical and financial consequence to having more sprinkler systems and a plant that may not be able to be made bigger without a remarkable investment. I mean, this just seems like one of those classic times to charge a lot for those who are using a lot and try to get them to use a little less. And hopefully not too less, so we lose revenue.
Seems to me that I don't get the equity thing up here for a variable rate, because it seems to me that if you own a home, there's a certain percentage of the infrastructure that you ought to be responsible for, even if you don't live in your home. So Lake Forest, we have people who live here 3 months out of the year. The infrastructure really costs the same amount for those homes as it does for the people who are here 12 months out of the year. So my argument is, if you want to be fair to everybody, you radically increase your fixed rate on a monthly basis and reduce the variable, because then everybody's paying the freight for what it costs to have water delivery to their home, whether they have a 5-inch pipe, 5/8-inch pipe, or a 3/4 or a 1.5. And 1.5 because the city required you to have a 1.5, so now you're required to have a higher fixed rate. So I see nothing that's inequitable about that. It's more predictable for the city because we have to cover the infrastructure costs. Plain and simple, no matter how much water flows through it, that's what we've got to cover. The rest is sort of gravy.
I kind of agree, and I'd like to add to that at $20 a quarter or $80 a year times 7,000 houses is about $560,000. And $80 a year is really, I hate to use the word cheap, but it's cheap for the privilege of hooking up to the best water system in the Midwest. So if you double that, hypothetically, and people paid $160 a year instead of $80 a year, that's over another $500,000 of revenue. And then if you had a progressive consumption fee based on the gallonage, for people who use excessive amounts of water, they pay a little bit more per gallon, then you're being conservation oriented. So the two of those together might be real beneficial, something to consider.
Well, and I think the fixed rate ought to include, by the way, a certain base rate of water usage, so that if you have small homeowners who run small amounts of water, they basically have a fixed charge for water every year that they know what it is. If you have somebody who's running, boatloads of water, they'll pay more, and that's fine. But I think that in order to protect, sort of the smaller end of the equation,
More predictable for them.
yeah, there ought to be some volume included in the fixed rate.
Other thoughts? Okay. Thank you.
Great
I think
input.
that's good input,
Thank you
yeah.
very much.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Mike. The next item on the agenda is other business, and the only official item of other business was the flash report, which we've all had a chance to look at. If there are any questions about the flash report, I would welcome them at this time. I actually have one question about the flash report. It had to do with the real estate transfer tax. Elizabeth, don't sit down so fast. I found myself having a difficult time figuring out what was going on. Most of the months that I've been looking at that particular piece of the flash report, it's been pretty clear that we, at least over the last year or so, we've been running at volumes of transactions that were roughly or approaching the same level that we had had back at the peak of 2007, 2008, but that our revenues were flat versus the prior year, which indicated, a significant reduction in maybe average transaction size or values or both. This year, I'm looking at it, and I think we seem to have turned some sort of a corner, and it appears that the volumes are still roughly the same, but that the revenues seem to be going up versus the prior year, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on that a bit.
Yeah, we had a really, really insane summer, I think, both in number of transactions and revenues. Just, it really, really seemed to take off. So, one thing I had started, and then it tapered off, obviously, in September, which we can see in the revenues. But I think what would be interesting is perhaps putting a schedule together with monthly revenues and numbers of transactions, and maybe just calculating an average
Per-
transaction amount, maybe for 2 years, and putting that in next month's packet, just so we can kind of see, it's not going to be scientific, but it'll give you a feel for trending, just kind of what's
Maybe a
happening.
median or something instead, so, because, one large transaction can skew those numbers pretty
Well, I think what we'll
significantly.
do is we'll pull commercial out.
Yep.
And just make it residential and just kind of see if that doesn't highlight some of that. But it was
So the volume of transactions was up.
significantly.
Yeah, okay.
I
yes.
heard they're up 40% this year.
It's very, very high. And I would also say that I think what's encouraging for me this summer is that we're seeing a lot of higher end residences sell, which is new. We haven't seen that for a while. And so we're seeing, the higher end sales close. So
It's interesting. If I can judge by the amount of traffic on the tollway every morning, I think things are getting better, only because the traffic is getting worse. So,
we'll add that schedule, just
thank you.
see if we can't.
When a big house sells and somebody new buys it, and someone who used to live in it for 25 years, those are typically lower taxes, and they usually take a great big jump, right? Because there's
Well, in theory.
Or not really?
In theory, it should keep up, because they should be looking at comparable sales in the area. And, every 3 years, it should be reassessed, and it should be keeping pace, but.
I can just speak, I can only speak for West Deerfield, which is where I live, for that township. The assessor, the last two assessors are very efficient and have had a really good record of maintaining sort of market level assessed valuations, and they react very quickly to changes in the market. So,
Two things. Our real estate transfer tax is based on the actual price, period. So if the house sells for double, we're getting double. But the assessor gets those P-tax forms from closing in about a week's time, and it's pretty much posted.
that's often not the case in Cook County. It's a very different structure to how they decide these things in Cook County.
Depends who you know.
What was that?
I said it depends who you know.
Okay, last item in the Finance Committee agenda, I'm sorry we've run a few minutes over, is opportunity for the public to address the Finance Committee. We'll have a city council meeting immediately following, so if there are matters for the city council, I would ask to hold those for that meeting, but if there are members of the public that would like to say something to the Finance Committee specifically, this is your opportunity. There being none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Seconded by Alderman Novit. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, meeting is adjourned.
And we will begin the council meeting at 7:45.
Okay.